A young mother hit by a car as she walks down the street. A young husband's worst fears coming true as he meets police.
I saw his expression. He nodded. I knew.
Prosecutors say the teen ran a stop sign and charged him with vehicular homicide. His lawyer insists it was just a horrible accident.
We're not saying he didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do anything criminally wrong.
But police say they can prove this was a crime, thanks to a mysterious letter.
It just says, I didn't witness the crash, but I have information that may help you with the crash.
Then, just when it looks like the case is over, a stunning twist you won't believe.
Pretty hard.
Dennis Murphy with a Dateline Court TV exclusive. And next, a young mother hit by a young driver. Was it an accident, or would the jury believe he had been a reckless speed demon?
This was really a tricked-out car.
It looked like a street racer.
And what shocking twist would stun everyone involved? A Dateline Court TV exclusive.
It's a moment every new parent looks forward to, taking your baby out for that first walk around the neighborhood. But for one young mother, that first walk was her last. She was hit and killed by a car. Was it just a horrible accident, or was there something about the driver that made this an accident waiting to happen? Ultimately, the decision would be left to a jury. At least, that's what everyone thought. Here's Dennis Murphy with a Dateline Court TV exclusive.
It happened in Greater Tampa, but it could have been a tidy lawn subdivision from anywhere. On the pleasant tree-lined street, a 26-year-old woman lay dead on the pavement, a crumpled baby carriage nearby.
I'm going 5 miles an hour. A lady's outside, and she hits my car in the front.
She was walking, sir?
Yeah. She walked out, and it just boom, she just hit my car.
The teenage driver who'd struck her had been on his way home from school.
She walked out in the street, I hit her with my car going 5 miles an hour.
He said it twice. He was only going 5 miles per hour.
A low-speed accident. Still, a young mother was dead, and a high school boy was shaken to his roots. But settling this apparently routine traffic case wasn't going to be as easy as a driver saying sorries that could never match the loss, or something about points on a driver's license. The sad collision on this corner would raise a vexing legal question. When does an accident become a crime? Can any one of us be just a few careless moments away from looking at prison time?
John Calder is the husband of Michelle Calder, the woman who died in the accident. At the time, the couple's baby girl, Caitlin, was 2 days shy of being 1 month old.
I just remember getting up really early in the morning. Caitlin was in the bassinet next to the bed, sleeping. Michelle was sleeping too, so I went over and kissed them both goodbye and slipped out to work.
John had hoped to get home that day to have lunch with his wife and baby, but he got caught at work.
I spoke with her once during the day. Just remember her telling me that she was going to go take the baby for a walk, and then we'd see each other later in the day.
It was the first walk, wasn't it?
Yeah. First walk outside the house.
It was around 1 p.m. when Michelle strapped Caitlin into her infant safety seat, attached the seat to the stroller, and set out for a walk along Branch Mooring Drive. The unimaginable was rounding the corner.
And I got a phone call that it was a sheriff's department and that my wife had been critically injured and that I need to get home immediately.
At home, John was met in his driveway by sheriff's deputies. They didn't have any details. They were waiting for Deputy Dwayne Parker, who was working the accident scene up the street.
I got out of my patrol car and the front door opened, and John was in the doorway. He's a big man, real big man. And he was crying. He looked at me and he said, "Tell me anything, but don't tell me she's dead."
I saw his expression. He nodded. I knew.
Baby Caitlin, miraculously some thought, survived the crash with no more than bumps and scrapes. She'd been thrown 30 feet as the baby's safety seat became a projectile launched from the demolished stroller. The infant landed upside down. Deputy Parker, whose job it was to figure out how the accident happened, determined that the marks on Michelle's body showed that her last act had been to save her child.
She pushed down on the stroller, rotates her body to the left, pushes the stroller to the left to get out of the way of the car before she was struck.
And she was swept up onto the hood of the car on her back.
She was hit, and then she rolled forward and struck the center of the windshield with her face.
The driver of the car, 17-year-old Ricky Del Rio, lived with his family just doors down from the Caldas, but they didn't know one another. Now the anguished boy, with his mother by his side, was explaining to Deputy Parker what had happened.
He told me he was coming around the corner. He didn't even know what he hit. He said all of a sudden, boom, something's in my windshield.
Said it happened just like that.
Just like that, never saw her.
According to Deputy Parker, Ricky Del Rio was cooperative, and with no other witnesses, it seemed like an open and shut investigation. But when Deputy Parker finished at the scene and returned to his vehicle, he spotted something a little odd.
Somebody stuck a letter underneath the windshield wiper. It just says, I didn't witness the crash, but I have information that may help you with the crash investigation.
The deputy followed up, and that note left on his windshield turned this accident into a criminal investigation. The note's writer lived across the street from where the collision occurred. He told Deputy Parker he wasn't at all surprised to hear that one of his neighbors, 17-year-old Ricky Del Rio, had been involved in an accident.
Every day at the same time, he hears this car coming down the road at a high rate of speed, and he looks up, and it's Mr. Del Rio's car. And as he comes in off the roadway, he never stops at the stop sign. He accelerates, and then he tries to cut the corner to go as fast as he can around the corner without stopping. And when he said that, the light went off in my head.
Now the deputy re-examined the teenager's story and focused on some of the details that seemed no big deal at first, like the observation that the driver's compact car had been given the cosmetics of a rubber-scorching performance vehicle.
Dummy racing instruments along the inside of the car, wide, low-profile wheels on there. He lowered the suspension by 2 inches.
So this was really a tricked-out car.
Yes.
Street racer?
It looked like a street racer.
Deputy Parker also looked at the teen's driving record. Ricky Del Rio had received 3 traffic tickets by the time he was 17 years old. But having prior infractions and the decals of a souped-up car still didn't mean Ricky Del Rio ran that stop sign that November day. And that's what the deputy was focusing on now. Had Ricky cruised through the intersection without braking? He went back to his notes of the boy's statement and to that 911 call.
She walked out and it just boom, she just hit my car.
And he keeps using the word boom. How much force does it take to make the sound boom? And he said in his 911 call that he was only going 5 miles per hour.
The deputy thought the distraught teenager could have been mistaken about his speed. Still, the picture that started to emerge was very different than the deputy's initial finding.
It's reckless driving. It's a willful and wanton disregard for property and people.
Did Ricky Del Rio drive his car in a reckless manner? Or was this a simple accident of wrong time, wrong place for 2 unlucky individuals? That question was about to be answered in a criminal court because Ricky Del Rio had been charged. A typical teenager on his way home from school would now stand trial for the homicide of his neighbor, and a conviction could send him to prison for the next 15 years of his life.
The battle over speed and stop signs, and the witness who claimed Ricky Del Rio had a habit of reckless driving.
I've never observed him come to a complete stop.
Or was there something else on that corner affecting the young man's driving that day? When our Dateline Court TV exclusive continues. From our studios in Rockefeller Center, here again is Stone Phillips.
Returning to our story, a young mother has been killed by a car while taking her baby on her first walk. The teenager behind the wheel insisted he was driving slowly and safely. But investigators have heard a different story about the young man's driving habits, and what was an accident investigation has become a criminal investigation. And that's not the only twist this story is about to take. Here again, Dennis Murphy.
8 months after the collision that killed Michelle Calder, Ricky Del Rio, the 17-year-old driver, was charged with vehicular homicide. Conviction on that count could mean 15 years in prison for the teenager.
A young lady by the name of Michelle Calder.
In July 2002, in a packed Tampa courtroom, The defendant, Ricky Del Rio, stared straight ahead, expressionless, as the prosecutor, Art McNeil, outlined his case for the jury as to why the teenager should go to prison.
This defendant failed to come to a stop at that stop sign. Instead, the defendant ran the stop sign, made an improper left turn at the intersection, and collided with Michelle. At the close of all the evidence, you will know beyond every reasonable doubt that this was definitely an avoidable tragedy.
Avoidable tragedy. Reckless. Those were the key words here. To get a conviction, the prosecution didn't need to prove that Ricky Del Rio intended to cause Michelle's death. He just needed to convince the jury that her death was avoidable. Problem for the state, though, there were no witnesses to the accident. The prosecutor's next best alternative was Lance Johnson, the resident of the subdivision who'd left the sheriff's deputy a note on his windshield saying he'd seen Ricky Del Rio blast through the fatal intersection plenty of times before.
I've never observed him come to a complete stop.
Approximately how many times have you observed him run that stop sign?
Every time I saw him come through the intersection.
Could you give us a number approximately?
Somewhere between 50 and 100 for sure.
So this is not a case where an individual is maybe working on the radio trying to change channel.
Some kind of distraction.
And inadvertently ran the stop sign. This is a case where this is his habit, that he habitually runs that stop sign.
To be sure, it's unusual for a person's routines, his or her habits, to be introduced in court as evidence. But the judge in this case allowed it. Still, that so-called habit of driving didn't mean that Ricky Del Rio ran the stop sign on the day Michelle Calder was killed. How would the state prove that? The answer? By calling the detective who painstakingly reconstructed the accident.
He intentionally ran the stop sign, trying to determine how fast he could go around the corner without stopping.
And what is the speed he was traveling around the corner?
Between 23 and 26 miles per hour.
That's how fast the car had to be going by the deputy's calculations to account for the injuries to the victim and the distance her baby was thrown, 23 to 26 miles per hour. Keep your eye on that number as you watch this videotape played for the jury. You see the deputy drive a car like Ricky's through the intersection. If the officer made a legal stop at the stop sign, he found he couldn't reach that speed before reaching the impact point.
The fastest I could get was between 12 and 14 miles per hour.
The only way the deputy could reach the 26 mile per hour speed was by cutting the corner without stopping at the stop sign. Something the deputy concluded the defendant did the day he collided with Michelle Calder. These speed calculations could be the prosecution's strongest piece of evidence. And there was also that 911 call. Again, the deputy's forensics indicated the driver was going approximately 5 times faster than he told the 911 operator.
My car going 5 miles.
He said, I was going 5 miles per hour. Now, he doesn't say that once, he says it twice. I'm going 5 miles per hour. No way in the world you can travel 5 miles per hour and the deceased, the victim, will go from the road all the way to the windshield. Doesn't happen.
Was the defendant lying? Was he going faster? Did he run the stop sign playing street racer? Now the defense would get its chance to give the jury a different interpretation of that accident.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now remember, you got to listen to all the evidence.
The defense lawyer, Joe Episcopo, knew the teenager and his family. And he, like many others, was astonished the boy would even be accused of a crime.
I had a binder full of attaboy letters about him that I took to the prosecutors. I lobbied them for 6 months to not file charges.
Don't go criminal with it, huh?
Exactly. I said, he's a good kid. Look at this kid's background.
As the defense lawyer saw his case, a big hurdle was what he called the sympathy factor. Could a jury be fair when the victim was a vibrant 26-year-old mother out for her first walk with her new baby?
If it had been O.J. Simpson had got killed in this, there would have been no charges. I maintain that it is who the victim is that makes this case the way it is. And you know, this presumption of innocence, it only applies on certain kinds of clients, movie stars, athletes, beautiful women.
How about teenagers in a subdivision with a tricked-out car?
Forget about it.
In his opening argument, the defense lawyer outlined a different version of the collision that killed a young mother and very nearly her newborn infant.
Yes, we agree that Ricky was driving and that he struck the woman. But there were other factors involved that came together to cause this unfortunate accident, and it wasn't recklessness on Ricky's part.
Not reckless for a good reason, said the lawyer. At the time of the accident, there was a big bush at that intersection, obscuring Ricky's vision. When the teenager looked left, he saw leaves, not the mother and child walking in the roadway.
This case, really, ladies and gentlemen, is about a simple bush.
And you're telling the jury, look at this bush.
We had an actual photograph of it in its full growing glory. When you stop for the stop sign, it blocks your vision.
And Ricky wasn't the only driver in that subdivision who claimed to have trouble seeing around that bush. Neighbor Janice Kelly testified she had to be extra cautious there, too.
And I had to stop either a car length and a half short of the stop sign to see, or pull into the intersection to see past the tree.
As for the neighbor who testified that Ricky habitually ran that stop sign,
I said I never saw him stop.
the defense portrayed him as being all alone in his opinion of the boy's driving skills.
I still don't know what his motive was, because, he's the only one that came in and testified. How can it be a habit?
Safe driver.
Neighbors who knew the young man testified that the defendant did in fact drive safely and that he always stopped at the stop sign in question. And the defense called the defendant's mother, who said those observations were accurate.
Did any neighbor ever come to you and complain about your son's driving?
Never.
Without a witness to the fatal accident itself, the defense would have to counter the prosecution's expert witness with one of its own.
My reconstruction.
The defense called Gary Stevens, a former police officer and expert on pedestrian collisions. No surprise, he disagreed with the prosecution's accident reconstruction. His analysis showed that Michelle's leg injuries, among other things, were not consistent with the 23 to 26 mile per hour speeds that Deputy Parker said the defendant had to be going.
There's very little contusions or abrasions, and generally speaking, at higher speeds, normally you'll see the beginning of a simple fracture.
The speed with which Michelle was struck was the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Now the defense's accident expert was concluding that Ricky was actually driving a bit slower than the asserted 23 to 26 miles per hour.
17 to 23 miles an hour on contact with the stroller and the pedestrian.
Here's the logic. If the young woman was struck at a slower speed, then the driver may well have stopped at the stop sign. The prosecution had shown the jury this video of Deputy Parker's accident reconstruction. Now the defense countered with an animation it had made that illustrated Ricky's version of the accident. In it, he stops at the sign, and a bush to his left makes a blind spot. The teenager makes the corner under the speed limit and plows directly into Michelle Calder and her child. It was just a kid involved in an accident, said his lawyer, and he urged the jurors to listen to the sincerity in Ricky's voice in that 911 call.
She's on the floor in the bed, and the blood's on the ground. Oh my God. I know, oh my God.
The defense attorney asked jurors to put themselves in Ricky's shoes. Should a momentary lapse behind the wheel of a car mean a 15-year prison sentence? Was that really homicide?
Maybe Ricky should have pulled up a little bit more. Maybe he should have been a little bit more careful. We're not saying he didn't do anything wrong. He didn't do anything criminally wrong.
Wrong, but not criminally wrong. That was the subtle but crucial distinction the defense wanted the jury to hear. According to the defense, there was plenty of reasonable doubt.
We don't have to prove anything. We just have to show there's a reasonable doubt. And that comes from the evidence, a lack of evidence, or contradictions in the evidence. We felt there were all three things.
After 3 days of dramatic and at times wrenching testimony, the jury would have to decide. Had Ricky Del Rio committed a homicide?
What would jurors believe? Was it an accident or a crime?
Everybody has been in a situation as a passenger or driver where you're a little bit careless, right?
Would they send Ricky Del Rio to prison? And what decision in the case would leave even the jury in shock? When our Dateline Court TV exclusive continues.
Was Michelle Calder's death an accident or was it a crime? A key prosecution witness claimed the 17-year-old who was behind the wheel often drove recklessly. The defense answered with an expert who said the car could not have been going very fast at the time of the crash. What will a jury say? As you're about to see, it may not matter. Dennis Murphy has the conclusion to our story.
Almost 2 years had passed since Ricky Del Rio turned a corner in his subdivision and struck and killed Michelle Calder. Her child, Caitlin, who survived the accident, was sitting in court with her father, who was anxious for it to be over.
I thought either way it was going to finally put an end to what happened that day.
And the defendant, Ricky Del Rio? He was facing 1 count of vehicular homicide, a charge which carries a sentence of up to 15 years in prison.
At this time, we'll now hear closing arguments.
In closing arguments, the prosecution hammered away at the notion that Michelle's death was avoidable, and Ricky Del Rio was at fault.
He failed to stop at the stop sign, and he made an improper turn. Those 2 acts by the defendant were reckless. If you believe the defendant committed one or both of those acts, then you must do your duty and find him guilty of vehicular homicide.
But the defense responded it was just a simple accident, not a criminal act.
This was not wanton, it was not willful, was not reckless. It was an accident.
Now a jury of 6 would decide, accident or crime. 3 of those jurors talked to Dateline.
Everybody has been in a situation as a passenger or driver where you're a little bit careless, right?
Absolutely, and being the youngest juror, I can see how it would happen, especially in a familiar place.
The jurors didn't see a complicated case. They told us they were persuaded most of all by 2 witnesses. The neighbor who left a note on the deputy's windshield and who testified that he often saw the Del Rio boy run the stop sign in question. And they believed the deputy himself who reconstructed the accident.
The math just didn't work out. There was no way that he stopped at that stop sign, and that was what we had to decide.
This is the way it was that day.
One juror didn't buy the defense's excuse about the shrubbery getting in the driver's line of sight.
If you live in this neighborhood, why would you not know that bush was there, didn't grow overnight?
He wasn't going to stop.
Even if the jurors had been unmoved by the defense, the burden of proof was on the prosecution. Had it proved its case, was the young driver reckless, wanton, and willful? So the jurors went back to Deputy Parker's testimony before making their decision. And they reviewed the definition of the charges, focusing on the word willful. In less than 1 hour of deliberations, all the jurors were in agreement.
Madam Clerk, would you publish the verdict, please?
Ricky Del Rio stood with his attorney, waiting to hear the words that would let him walk free or send him to prison.
We, the jury, finds as follows as to the defendant in this case. A, the defendant is guilty of vehicular homicide as charged.
Ricky Del Rio, guilty of vehicular homicide. As the verdict was read, there were tears on both sides of the courtroom.
I could hear Michelle's husband from that whole family, almost a cry of relief.
I heard the verdict, and then I wasn't sure if I just heard what I wanted to hear or if they actually did say guilty.
Take the defendant into custody.
Yes,
Court's adjourned.
Court stands adjourned.
Ricky Del Rio's family members looked devastated. All they could do was watch as the defendant was handcuffed and led out of the courtroom. Satisfied with the verdict, the victim's family, the Calders, thought they would finally have the closure they needed. They were satisfied justice had been served. But this courtroom drama was far from over.
How much of a bitterness is this on what's already a bitter episode?
Definitely adding salt to the wound. There's so many ways it could have gone. And this is the one that was the most unexpected to me.
It's routine in a great many trials for a defense attorney to file a motion asking a judge to overturn a guilty verdict. In most cases, judges leave the ultimate decision about the facts of a case to a jury, but not in this one. Just 10 days after Ricky Del Rio was convicted of vehicular homicide, the judge in the case set aside the jury's verdict, clearing Del Rio of all charges. Ricky Del Rio was now an innocent man, without so much as a ticket to pay for killing a woman with his car.
The jurors we spoke to were completely surprised by the judge's action and angry about it.
I just was left with just a feeling of disappointment that justice had not been served.
I heard it on the radio, I saw it on TV that morning. I don't know what further evidence the judge needed to, do this.
We wondered too. So we requested an interview with the judge, but he declined to speak with Dateline. We turned to former federal prosecutor and law professor at the University of Florida, Michael Siegel, to explain how a jury verdict could be set aside. According to Professor Siegel, who read the judge's opinion for us, the judge decided that Del Rio's driving was not necessarily reckless.
The judge says, I believe that had a police officer been parked on that corner and watched him come through the stop sign, assuming he ran the stop sign, I don't believe he would have been cited for reckless driving. It's just not egregious enough. And therefore, if he wouldn't have been cited for reckless driving, he can't be guilty of vehicular homicide.
It's beyond me. It's something I'll never understand. And I have absolutely no faith in this system. I think I would have more faith if I was a criminal.
Pretty hard words.
Yes, and I mean them from the bottom of my heart.
John Calder turned to an internet support group for help after the death of his wife. Through it, he met a widow with a young son. They have since married and just a few months ago welcomed a new baby boy into the family. As for Ricky Del Rio, in the past year, he has been ticketed twice for moving violations, including speeding.
A young mother hit by a car as she walks down the street. A young husband's worst fears coming true as he meets police.
I saw his expression. He nodded. I knew.
Prosecutors say the teen